evening. It is Wednesday, the 24th of October. This is the big story. My name is Michelle Ngele Odhiambo. Now, tonight, that Raila Odinga is among the high-ranking Kenyan government officers locally and in the continent is not news. But last week's appointment of the opposition leader to the African Union as a special envoy for infrastructure development in Africa has left many talking. The latest to come out of those conversations is that the push for a referendum will soon die a natural death after Raila becomes too busy in his new role. But his supporters are dismissing that notion with sheer scorn, saying Raila is just like any other person harboring presidential ambitions and also serving in government. Another narrative that has been sparked by the AU appointment is that Raila Odinga is no longer part of the opposition but a government employee. NC Secretary General Baraka Muluka says his party leader Musalia Mudavadi should take up the role of official opposition leader in that regard. Muluka argues that Raila will be remunerated for his new role by the AU through the government of Kenya and therefore cannot speak for the opposition. President Uhuru Kenyatta was the first to announce the appointment of Raila Odinga on Saturday. On the show tonight, I have political analyst David Osianya. Later on, we'll have political strategist Abel Onchari Oyeyo. But as usual, before I engage them, our lead reporter is with a legal mind and a member of parliament to speak on the emerging issues around Raila's appointment to the AU. But before that, let's listen in to what Uhuru Kenyatta had to say on the appointment.
We are happy that now we have the African Union who have recognized our brother Raila Amolo Odinga and appointed him as the High Representative for Infrastructure Development in Africa.
Juzi mimi niliulizwa na mkuu wa African Union niwe kama balozi ya kuunganisha Afrika na kwa upande ya miundo msingi. Na mimi nimekubali.
Well, political analyst David Osianya will be joining us for that conversation. But first, Sophia Anuna with the latest on the same. She will be speaking to a member of parliament on the emerging issue. Sophia, good evening.
Good evening, Michelle. What's definite is that following that 9th March 2018 handshake between President Uhuru Kenyatta and former Prime Minister Raila Odinga, the political landscape in Kenya took a different turn. Other than cooling the political temperatures, that antagonistic nature of politics we'd witnessed ahead of the 2017 general election has all toned down. In fact, what has been interesting to see is that there's more bipartisanship between Jubilee and NASA, and some of the issues we've seen emerge politically are within Jubilee. Just recently, we had the Deputy President talking about those who may want to chase him out of Jubilee will not succeed, so that some of the issues within Jubilee have escalated to the extent that some look at the former Prime Minister Raila Odinga suspiciously and see his joining of hands with Uhuru Kenyatta, real motive and the same, is definitely one of the developments we've been seeing recently politically. And so this appointment by the AU to be a special envoy, high representative infrastructure development in the continent, has seen those in the Jubilee circle say, okay, you have this appointment now, focus on continental issues, forget local politics, because one of the things that has been an issue and has been seen to see those allied, especially to the Deputy President who seeks to succeed his boss, the President, is that Raila Odinga would run again in 2022. So they're saying forget 2022, focus on continental politics. And so there's a lot of alignments, realignments, and so many things happening in the political circles. But let's speak now with Rarieda, Member of Parliament, Otiende Amolo, and get more perspective on just how this is being viewed even in Parliament. Thank you for making time for us. Let's begin with first debunking the myths we've seen around this, because there are those who say he's not going to be earning a salary through from the AU, perhaps through the Kenyan government. How long is this going to be for? He's going to be very busy. He can't engage in Kenyan politics. What do you tell the people who are concerned about this nomination or appointment rather, and see it as one that means he cannot continue to be active in Kenyan politics?
Thank you, Sophia. But first of all, let me explain that I think that discussion and debate about whether the appointment of Raila Odinga as the High Representative of the African Union on Infrastructure and Development bars him from participating in Kenyan politics, basically that discussion is misplaced and unfounded for three basic reasons. First of all, that appointment itself is political. The African Union is a political outfit. So you cannot then imagine that because one has a higher political appointment, you can bar them or it can stop them from participating in local politics. Secondly, the constitutive documents of the African Union do not require of anyone appointed as a high representative not to be involved in politics. And we have seen many examples, including persons who have been chairs of the AU. Jean Ping ran for president. Lamine Zuma, wanted to be the president of South Africa, and there are many other examples. Thirdly, the focal point for the discussion must be our constitution and our electoral laws. Is there anything in the constitution, in the electoral laws, that bars anybody in that position from running? The answer is no. And therefore, that discussion in terms of technical competence is misplaced. I believe that those who are raising the discussion are those who are worried because they know that in the past, Raila Odinga has won elections, but somehow because of electoral manipulation has never been declared. And I think they are worried that with that history, come 2022, with Raila on the ballot paper, and with the handshake team, the Building Bridges initiative, looking at the electoral laws in terms of areas of manipulation, I think they are worried that then he becomes a frontrunner. And so I think they are trying to seize the opportunity to try and create an aura that there are things that would bar Raila from running, but it is not true. Yes.
All right. We had the president during the Mashujaa celebrations talking about Kenyans should be happy because now that he's from Kenya and he's in charge of infrastructural development, perhaps he'll be starting with roads and infrastructure in Kenya. But that's not to say he'll go to some village somewhere to fix a road just because of this position. And also, AU is dependent on being able to raise resources from funds outside and the global funds as we know them.
The president necessarily has to be happy. First of all, to be appointed to those positions, usually there has to be concurrence of the head of state. So I am quite sure that President Uhuru Kenyatta concurred. Secondly, Raila, to the best of my memory, is the first Kenyan appointed to such a position. And that, of course, also elevates the country. But more importantly, the kind of position that the High Representative occupies is a strategic one. It is not one who then comes and says that Karumaindu Nyeri Road is to be fixed. But it's a strategic one because you engage with heads of state, you engage with development partners and others. So it is strategic in terms of finding ways of enabling infrastructural development in Africa. And in doing so, you are also able to find ways of advantaging your own home country. And so I imagine that as the High Representative, if Raila were to negotiate with certain development partners, whether it's the Bretton Woods or other partners, in terms of infrastructural development, a sizable portion of it would come to us. You remember that when President Obama started that project of electrification in Africa, necessarily Kenya benefited, among others, even if it was not the only country. But so there's a certain advantage in having a person who is a national of a particular country occupying such a position.
Okay. Let's talk about the import of not only this position he's now occupying, but also the handshake. There are those who said, still continue to say, the place of the opposition in Kenya has largely been diminished, that now Raila Odinga, ODM, NASA is reading from the same script as the president. In fact, some have gone to as far as call on the likes of Musalia Mudavadi to come out and take the opposition leadership so as to ensure still there's accountability and checking of government in place. Do you see it that way?
I've made this point repeatedly, and it bears repeat. I am an elected ODM member. By definition, we are the minority, whether as ODM or as NASA. And as minority, the Constitution gives us a certain role to play. It is a role we will always continue to play. So there is no question of saying that there's no minority or there's no opposition, because the Constitution actually requires us to stay there. Under the Constitution, if you were to actually cross over then you would even lose your seat. So we are there by definition of the Constitution and by law. What has happened is not that the opposition has crossed over. What has happened is that there's been a cessation of hostilities. Quite honestly, where we were, and some of us were in the thick of it, if we were to continue that way for another 1 or 2 months, I do not think we would have a country we are calling Kenya today. I think there would have been very many deaths by now. I think the economy would have collapsed. So it was a good thing that we ceased the hostilities. It is not a crossover in terms of ideology, in terms of anything else, but it's just a recognition that we have political differences, we are on different sides of the political divide, but there's a greater calling to try and keep this country together rather than to break it. Yeah. And that's where we are.
All right. The referendum push as well has been dominating news headlines. You are part of the constitution-making process. And while some now continue to call for an expanded executive and a parliamentary system, that is what all the drafts had proposed in the lead up to what was actually promulgated by Kenyans until that Naivasha meeting, where some say some mischief happened. In your view, is that the case, and that's why we are back here paying for the sins of one meeting that undid years of expertise?
Yes, in many ways, yes. We ended up with a presidential system because we had to bargain. And the bargain was, do we remain with a centralized government structure and not devolve on the one hand? Do we have a presidential system or a parliamentary system on the other? Those who preferred a centralized structure, as we had had for almost 48 years, had also preferred a presidential system. Those who preferred a parliamentary system were also in favor of devolution. So at the end of the day, the politicians did a trade-off in Naivasha. We will accept devolution provided you give us a presidential system. Where we are now 8 years later, fortunately, devolution has taken such deep root that no one can debate whether we need it or not. The only debate can be, do we maintain the structure in terms of reducing or increasing? What kind of powers do we give them? But so it is a good time now to revisit the kind of system of government we want without any blackmail. We can now ask ourselves honestly that having had this presidential system for 8 years and the hybrid system for almost 50 years before that, do we now consider the parliamentary system? And I happen to be one of those who, not only now, but even when we were making the Constitution, and indeed most of us in the Committee of Experts, preferred a parliamentary system because the unique nature of this country, it makes it singularly suited for a parliamentary system rather than a presidential one.
So let me put it to you this way, because there are those who say this is all about the ambition of the politicians, that at the time we were going to the 2010 promulgation, Raila Odinga was Prime Minister. He had a lot of sway, but because he thought it was imminent that he'd be president, he then supported a presidential system because he did not want to share power in as far as the parliamentary system is concerned. And that's why even those who say Ruto, for a long time until recently he said he's open to it, was opposed to it because he thinks it's imminent that he will be president, and then he does not want to have to share and split power between a ceremonial president or whatever kind of hybrid system may be there, so that at the end of the day it's about politicians and what they want. Because had Raila Odinga supported this then, we would have a parliamentary system.
Those who say that either don't know history or wish to distort history. Raila has always been very clear. And in the submissions before the Guy team before us, in the submissions that were made to the Committee of Experts, and even the discussions after that, he was always, and he has always remained in favor of a parliamentary system for very good reasons. But he had to concede, because where we were, if any of the two divides were to oppose the Constitution, it would never pass. Any time that the Constitution passes, it's if the major players, at that time it was Kibaki and Raila, supported it. So that certainly would not be true. Secondly, I hear those who say that now we are talking about amending the Constitution because we want to create positions. And I think it's the most illogical argument. If it was creating positions, then what position would be created for Raila? Because the only thing Raila has always wanted to run for is president. the position of president is already in the current constitution. And in fact, the presidential system makes the president the centerpin of action, as opposed to a parliamentary system that really subjects the president to the mercy of parliament. You are aware, for example, in South Africa, the way they have removed at least 2 of their presidents. You are aware that in Australia, I think in 7 years, they have had 11 prime ministers. So if you are a person who wants just a position and wants a powerful one, then you would not be advocating for a parliamentary system. There is no position that can possibly be created in the constitution that Raila would be waiting to be created. And therefore, it's a highly illogical argument.
Yeah. So as we bring this to a close, I put this to you. In Jubilee, there have been some jitters around this handshake, and the president and the former prime minister have both said that they know in their ranks there are people who are not too happy with the same because they thrived in those kind of very antagonistic politics. So what threat do you think Raila poses, and more specific to the deputy president, who largely we see his allies come out to speak against the former prime minister?
I cannot speak for Jubilee, but what I can say, one, is that anybody who hoped or hopes to ascend to the highest office in this land by maintaining the divisions, the fundamental political divisions that we've had in this country, obviously would be upset when those divisions appear to be diminished. Secondly, anybody who hoped or hopes to ascend to the highest office in this land by virtue of riding on the, should I say, the regional and ethnic politics that we've always had, and that equation will obviously be worried when that regional and ethnic polarization appears to be dissolved slowly. And I would therefore understand those who are jittery in Jubilee because the 2 political sides appear to be, agreeing on a greater need. Yes. I would also understand, therefore, even those who have been in NASA but had hoped to clinch certain deals and appear to have been upstaged by the handshake between Uhuru Kenyatta and Raila Odinga. So necessarily that has to be. That is what I've called the political movement of tectonic plates. Yes.
What should the president do to exploit this cessation, if you like, in terms of the nature of politics we had before? He's shaken hands with Raila Odinga. You have Kalonzo Musyoka now saying he's on the table. Wetangula was in State House the other day, although again we saw him saying he supports Ruto for 2022. Mudavadi has not been very clear, but what should he do in this particular moment to make sure this is not a moment lost?
This moment is very ideal, and there are 3 fundamental things that we should do, taking advantage of this. First, we should take advantage of it to exploit to the highest level possible the development agenda, because the unity gives a good atmosphere to pursue development infrastructure in this country. Secondly, it is a good opportunity to pursue the fight against corruption and against impunity, because with that scenario, the push and the perception that you're only focusing on certain persons or certain tribes diminishes. Thirdly, it is a good time to try and diminish the tribalism that we have in this country. But all that should be done in one major context. It is the ideal time to re-examine the constitution that we gave ourselves, because history of this country and also has shown that the best time to refocus on the question of the constitution is always when the major political divides appear united in thought.
Many thanks.
Thank you.
Otiende Amolo is a member of parliament, and he says this is that time that Kenya should take advantage of, maximize, to ensure that as a country we are able to develop and get Kenya to where it should be. But definitely, Michelle, the realignments politically have already begun, and with quite some years to go, say 4 to 2022 elections, we are likely to see so much more. They say a day in politics is like 1,000 days. So there will be a lot to be seen, especially in the context of this newfound relationship between the former Prime Minister and the President, Michelle.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. There is our lead reporter, Sophia Wanuna. Now, earlier today, members of ODM addressed the media on the matter. Here now is the Mathare Member of Parliament, Anthony Luot, explaining why the referendum drive is still very much alive.
There is also the misplaced notion that the referendum drive was a vehicle to catapult His Excellency Raila Amolo Odinga to his new position, and his appointment now puts to an end. This is what they have been trying to postulate, that his appointment now puts to an end the push for constitutional reforms. Nothing could be further from the truth. The call for a referendum is firmly rooted in the Constitution, specifically under Articles 255, 256, and 257.
Well, in studio, political analyst David Osiany joins us to put more context into the matter. Many thanks for joining us on the big story tonight. Raila Odinga's appointment by the African Union now causing jitters across the political scene. But what impact will this appointment have on his role as the opposition leader?
Well, thank you very much, Michelle, for having me. I think it is important to understand the role Raila Odinga will be playing. And with that understanding, therefore, it is easy to decipher whether or not this will easily shift him off the political landscape in the country. Now, Raila Odinga becomes the fifth High Representative, appointed by a sitting AU chair. The first four were, almost all of them were presidents. So you had Pierre Buyoya, the former president of Burundi, who was the High Representative to Mali and the Sahel area. Then you had Jose Barrito, the former Prime Minister for Cape Verde, who was a High Representative to try and resolve the crisis in the Cote d'Ivoire region. You also had Jerry Rawlings, who still sits as the High Representative to Somalia, and of course Alpha Konare, the former president of Mali, who has been the High Representative to South Sudan to try and resolve the crisis. However, Raila Odinga becomes the first person or High Representative with a continental mandate. So his role, as was described in his appointing letter, which I bet most of us must have read, is to try and shore up support for the African continent, especially to the development partners. He is also entrusted with the noble duty of trying to gather together the heads of state and letting them own up to basic agreements by the African Union, one of them being the African Free Continental Trade Area Agreement that was recently done in March in Rwanda, where we essentially, Raila is to try and ensure that once we agree to various protocols in the AU, the countries that agree to it follow through. And so he will be touching base with the presidents and prime ministers and leaders of various countries to have their buy-in and commitment. Now, infrastructural development is key to Africa's economic growth. It is also extremely important for its political growth and connection.
We'll get to the importance of this role in just a moment, but you've done us a great service there explaining Raila's role in this new appointment, because another conversation that has cropped up then is that in playing this, or in taking up this role, Raila Odinga will no longer be part of the opposition, but a government employee. And this is from ANC Secretary General Barack Muluka here, who says Raila Odinga will be remunerated for his new position through the government of Kenya. He therefore cannot say that he will be speaking for the opposition.
Michelle, you know, it has been said time upon number that politics is like soccer, all right? And just as politics is like soccer, it would suffice to say that a player like Oliech, who doesn't play for this country, does not stop playing in the country when he comes back. It would be wrong. I don't think I want to push the notion that it would push Raila out. It will entirely be upon him to choose whether or not he feels that his presence in the political arena locally may sabotage his role and duty elsewhere, because there are chances also that he may end up meddling in the politics locally, and that may affect his work elsewhere. But also, for those of us who know Raila Odinga, you know he's a gentleman who is quite a workaholic. So juggling these responsibilities may not be a problem for him per se. So I do not time will tell. Let's leave it to time.
All right, we'll be continuing this conversation in a moment. That is political analyst David Osianyu. When we come back, we'll bring in political strategist Abel Onchari Oyeyo as we discuss the possibility of an orphaned opposition based on the jitters now being seen across the political scene there by Raila Odinga's appointment as an African Union High Representative. The conversation